Hey there, fellow philosophers. You ready to go on a little thought adventure with me today?
It's a deep dive, but not just any deep dive. We're going into medieval philosophy.
And we're going deep, like really deep, looking at all the little details and complexities that, you might not see at first glance.
Exactly. And we've got a great starting point for this deep dive because our listeners sent in a fantastic resource. The Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy's entry on medieval philosophy. I gotta admit, even I was blown away by how much I didn't know.
It is amazing how this era that people often see as this quiet time between antiquity and the Renaissance was actually a super dynamic period, just bursting with new ideas and these incredible conversations happening across cultures.
So let's break this down. Medieval philosophy, it wasn't just happening in some dusty corner of Europe, right? This was a global conversation spanning from Byzantium to Baghdad, Cordoba to Paris. Yeah, and what's really striking is that it wasn't just people passively receiving ancient wisdom. Thinkers from all these different religious backgrounds, Christian, Islamic, and Jewish, were deeply engaged with these ancient texts. They weren't just absorbing them, they were challenging them, reinterpreting them, and ultimately, blazing new trails.
It's like they're having this philosophical duel with the giants of the past.
Exactly. And the way they did this through commentaries is so different from how we approach philosophy today. Imagine a world where the starting point isn't a problem to be solved, but a text to be dissected, argued with, and built upon.
I haven't thought about it that way. It's like they saw these texts as living things, always evolving through interpretation and reinterpretation.
Precisely.
Yeah.
Take Aristotle, for example. He was the rock star of medieval philosophy. His works, translated into all these different languages, became the subject of countless commentaries. Each generation added its own layer of understanding.
It makes you wonder if Aristotle would even recognize his own ideas after they'd been, filtered through so many brilliant minds.
Right. That's a great question. And it wasn't just Aristotle. The Bible, the Quran, Boethius's Consolation of Philosophy, Peter Lombard's Sentences, they all became focal points for philosophical inquiry. They sparked new interpretations and challenged traditional ways of thinking.
It's like this philosophical chain reaction, each commentary triggering a new explosion of ideas.
Absolutely. And to understand how this intellectual chain reaction started, we have to go back to the so-called Platonic schools of Athens and Alexandria.
Platonic schools.
Yeah.
But I thought Aristotle was the main attraction.
He was, and this is where it gets a bit paradoxical. These schools, even though they were called Platonic, were actually super into Aristotle's philosophy.
So they were kind of studying Aristotle through a Neoplatonic lens, finding connections between these two philosophical titans.
Exactly. And this approach, this way of reading Aristotle, it got passed down through the centuries. It really formed the bedrock of medieval philosophy. But of course, there were other influences at play too. Augustine in the Latin tradition, Kalam theology in the Arabic world, and Talmudic commentary in Jewish thought.
So cool are these different threads. Ancient Greek philosophy, religious doctrines, and different cultural contexts all came together to create this incredibly rich tapestry of medieval thought.
Yeah, it truly is. And to add another layer of complexity, we have these massive translation movements happening, facilitating the flow of ideas across cultures and languages.
These translations weren't just some, mechanical task. They were intellectual feats. They required a deep understanding of the languages, the cultures, and the philosophical concepts themselves.
Exactly. Just imagine the impact of suddenly gaining access to a whole new world of thought, encountering ideas that challenged your assumptions and pushed you to think in new ways.
It's like cracking open a philosophical treasure chest and discovering a whole trove of intellectual gems.
Precisely. And this cross-cultural exchange, this whole process of translation and reinterpretation was absolutely essential for the development of medieval philosophy in all its different forms.
Okay, so now that we've set the stage, I'm really excited to dive into the specific philosophical styles that emerged during this period. Where do we even begin?
Well, let's start with Byzantine philosophy. This was a tradition that had direct access to the ancient Greek texts and was wrestling with the complex relationship between philosophy and Christianity. Thinkers like Michael Psellos and John Idalos, they were super into Aristotle's works. But their philosophical explorations, they weren't always welcomed by the church authorities.
Ah, that classic tension between reason and revelation, philosophy and theology. I bet it was a tough balancing act for these Byzantine thinkers.
It definitely was. They were navigating a world where challenging established dogma could have some pretty serious consequences.
I can imagine. Okay, so what about the Latin West? What was happening there philosophically between, say, 800 and 1100?
Well, this period saw a huge emphasis on logic and linguistic analysis. Thinkers were poring over Boethius's translations and commentaries on Aristotle's logical works. They were really honing their skills in argumentation and conceptual clarity.
It sounds like they were building the foundation for the big philosophical debates that would come later.
Exactly. And while most thinkers in this era were focused on the intricacies of logic, there were a couple of notable exceptions: John Scotus Erigena and Anselm.
Exceptions. How so?
Well, at a time when everyone else was quoting authorities, like the ancients and the church fathers, these two guys were all about original reasoning. They barely even mentioned their sources. They'd internalize the teachings of Boethius and Augustine and use that knowledge to, forge their own philosophical paths.
It's like they were absorbing the wisdom of the past, but then using it to create something totally new.
Exactly. For example, Erigena wrote this masterpiece, Paraphysion, where he drew on Neoplatonic ideas to explore the nature of God and the universe. He even used his contemporary's favorite logic textbook, a Latin paraphrase of Aristotle's categories, to delve into these really deep metaphysical questions.
Wow, that's quite a mix of influences. What about Anselm? What made him stand out?
Anselm is probably best known for his famous ontological argument for God's existence, this super ambitious attempt to prove God's existence using just reason. He also developed this very sophisticated theory of free will that had a huge impact on philosophical discussions for centuries.
It sounds like both Erigena and Anselm were true philosophical pioneers, pushing the boundaries of thought and challenging the intellectual status quo. Okay, let's shift gears and talk about the Islamic world. What was happening there philosophically around this time?
Well, the Islamic world was witnessing the rise of falsafa. It basically means philosophy in Arabic. This was a really vibrant intellectual movement fueled by the translation of Greek philosophical texts, especially the works of Aristotle, into Arabic.
So it was like a philosophical rediscovery of ancient wisdom, but happening in a new cultural and religious context.
Precisely. And one of the early figures in this tradition was Al-Kindi. He was really drawn to Neoplatonic ideas. He saw philosophy as a way to understand the world and to get closer to God.
So for him, philosophy was like a bridge between the human and the divine.
Exactly. And Al-Farabi, another big name in falsafa, built on Al-Kindi's legacy. He was like this total Renaissance man, writing about logic, ethics, politics, metaphysics, you name it. He advocated for the idea that philosophy gives us this really solid demonstrative knowledge, just as certain as mathematics.
Because he saw philosophy as this very rigorous and systematic way of pursuing truth.
Absolutely. He believed that philosophy, when guided by reason, could illuminate the mysteries of the universe and lead us to a deeper understanding of God's creation.
He sounds like a real visionary.
He was, and his work really laid the groundwork for the most influential philosopher of them all, Ibn Sina, known in the Latin West as Avicenna.
Avicenna. His name is practically synonymous with medieval philosophy. What made him so significant?
Well, Avicenna was this incredible synthesizer. He took Aristotle's complex system of thought and reworked it, rearranging things, clarifying things, and expanding upon it in these massive philosophical encyclopedias. He wasn't afraid to disagree with Aristotle, but he always did it respectfully and with a deep understanding of Aristotle's arguments.
It's like he was having this conversation with Aristotle across the centuries.
Exactly, and his impact was enormous. His works were translated into Latin, and they became central texts in European universities, shaping the philosophical landscape for centuries to come.
I mean, it's amazing to think about the extent of his influence, bridging the Islamic and Christian worlds. Now, was everyone in the Islamic world so on board with this falsafa movement?
Yeah.
Were there any alternative approaches to philosophy?
Oh yeah, there definitely were. A distinct school of thought emerged called Kalam. It focused on theological problems raised by the Quran, and they were always debating with other religious traditions.
Kalam, what was their style like?
Well, Kalam thinkers, while they engaged with philosophical questions, their main concern was to defend Islamic doctrines. They often used reason and logic, not just to clarify religious beliefs, but also to refute the arguments of other religions.
So it was a more theologically driven kind of philosophy, really focused on defending and explaining Islamic beliefs.
Exactly. And they developed some really different ideas from the Falasif. For instance, they argued for an atomistic physics, this idea that the world is made up of these indivisible particles. This contrasted sharply with Aristotle's view of the cosmos as this continuous and hierarchically ordered thing.
So you've got these two distinct styles of philosophizing happening in the Islamic world. Falsafa, which was deeply engaged with Greek philosophy, and Kalam, which was more rooted in Islamic theology. Did these two schools of thought ever, interact with each other?
Absolutely. And probably the most interesting example of this is Al-Ghazali. He was this incredibly brilliant guy who was deeply involved in both Kalam and Falsafa.
Al-Ghazali, didn't he write that really scathing critique of the philosophers?
He did. But his relationship with philosophy was actually super complex. He was a master of Kalam theology, a scholar of Avicenna's philosophy, and a practitioner of Sufism, a mystical tradition within Islam. He wrote a ton about all these subjects, navigating between different perspectives and always challenging established ideas.
Wow, what a powerhouse. So how did he manage to, bring together these different approaches to knowledge and truth?
Well, in his most famous book, The Incoherence of the Philosophers, he goes after Avicenna and other Falasif on a few key points. He argues that their views on the eternity of the world, the limits of God's knowledge, and the denial of bodily resurrection, all these things contradict Islamic doctrines.
So he saw some fundamental problems with how philosophy was being used.
Yeah, he did. But he didn't completely reject philosophy. In fact, his critique actually helped to integrate Avicennian philosophy into Kalam by showing that it was mostly compatible with Islam as long as you avoid certain conclusions.
So he was trying to draw a line, identifying the points where philosophy and theology clashed.
Precisely. And it's worth noting that Al-Ghazali himself was influenced by philosophical ideas. He was a big proponent of the idea that God's will played a key role in creation, an idea that contrasted with the more deterministic views of some of the Falasuf.
So even as he was critiquing philosophy, he was using philosophical ideas to shape Islamic theology.
Exactly. And this complex back and forth between Falsafa and Kalam really shows how dynamic and multifaceted intellectual life was in the medieval Islamic world.
This is all so interesting, but before we go any deeper into these debates, let's take a little detour. We're going to 12th century Paris, where a totally unique style of philosophizing was emerging in the schools that would eventually become the University of Paris.
Yeah, those Parisian schools were like a melting pot of intellectual energy. They attracted scholars from all over Europe, and they fostered this spirit of inquiry that would really lay the groundwork for the whole university tradition.
So what were these Parisian philosophers all riled up about? What were the hot topics of the day?
Well, lots of them were super into the logical curriculum. They were dissecting texts, analyzing arguments, and refining their skills in reasoning. But unlike the folks who came before them, they had a much deeper understanding of the texts. This was partly thanks to the availability of Arabic translations and commentaries.
So it's like they were building on the foundation laid by Boethius and others, but with new tools and a broader perspective.
Exactly. And this deeper engagement with logic led them to develop this totally unique approach to metaphysics, where they use logic not just to analyze language, but also to explore, the very nature of reality.
Whoa, a metaphysical system built on logic. That's ambitious.
It was. And one of the main figures in this movement was Peter Abelard. He was brilliant, but also kind of controversial. He was never afraid to challenge the status quo.
Abelard. I know him more for his crazy love story with Heloise than for his philosophical ideas.
It's true, their story is legendary. But Abelard was a groundbreaking philosopher too. He challenged the traditional view of universals, arguing that we can understand the world without these abstract entities.
So he was really shaking things up. He was questioning some fundamental assumptions of medieval philosophy.
He was, and he wasn't afraid to apply his logical skills to theological questions, which often got him into hot water with the church authorities.
Paris sounds like a pretty exciting place to be a philosopher back then.
It was, and another big name in those Parisian schools was Gilbert of Poitiers. He created this really complex metaphysical system based on careful distinctions between different kinds of discourse. He was also super involved in theological debates, always trying to use logic and reason to make sense of religious doctrines.
So both Abelard and Gilbert were pushing the boundaries of philosophical inquiry, with logic as their main tool.
Precisely. And their influence was huge. Their followers, the Nominals inspired by Abelard, and the Puritani by Gilbert continued to develop their ideas, shaping philosophical debates for decades to come.
It's amazing to see how these intellectual movements pick up steam, how one idea sparks another, and how individual thinkers can have such a lasting impact.
Absolutely. Now, let's head south from Paris to Islamic Spain. This region was this amazing cultural crossroads where Islamic, Christian, and Jewish traditions were all intertwined. It was also a real hotbed of philosophical activity.
Islamic Spain. It was a period of incredible intellectual and artistic flourishing, wasn't it?
It was. And just like Paris had its own philosophical style, 12th century Islamic Spain had a distinctive approach to knowledge, with a strong emphasis on both science and philosophy.
So they were drawing on the Greek philosophical heritage too, kind of like the Philosophe.
Yes, but in their own way. Thinkers like Ibn Tufayl and Averroes were deeply into Aristotle's works, but they brought their own unique perspectives to the table, shaped by their own cultures and religious contexts.
Tell me about Ibn Tufayl. What made him special?
Well, Ibn Tufayl is best known for his philosophical novel, Haley ibn Yaqzan. It's this fascinating story about a guy who's raised alone on a desert island, and just by observing and using reason, he develops a philosophical system that perfectly aligns with Avicenna's teachings.
Like a philosophical Robinson Crusoe.
Right. It's this really powerful exploration of the limits of human reason and the idea that maybe we can discover truth independently of any culture or religious tradition.
It's a really compelling thought experiment.
It is. Now, Averroes was perhaps the most hardcore Aristotelian of the entire medieval period.
Averroes. I remember studying his commentaries on Aristotle. He was a big deal in the Latin philosophical tradition.
He was. His commentaries on Aristotle's works were super detailed and insightful. They became required reading for Christian scholars and played a huge role in shaping the curriculum of European universities.
It's incredible to think about how ideas can travel across these cultural and religious boundaries and spark whole new movements.
It is. And then there's Moses ben Maimon, known in the Latin West as Maimonides, another key figure in Islamic Spain.
Maimonides. He's a giant Jewish thought, right?
Yeah.
A great legal scholar and philosopher.
You got it. He's considered one of the top authorities on Jewish law, but he was also a brilliant philosopher who really wrestled with that age-old problem of faith and reason.
That tension runs through like the entire history of philosophy, right? How did Maimonides deal with it?
Well, his masterpiece, The Guide of the Perplexed, goes right to the heart of that question. It's a really complex book, and scholars are still arguing about what it really means. Some people think Maimonides ultimately sides with Aristotle, while others think he's more skeptical of reason and its limits.
It's so interesting that even within his own work, there's this ongoing conversation between faith and reason, tradition and innovation.
Exactly, and that really points to a key theme that runs throughout medieval philosophy. This interplay between different ways of knowing, how thinkers use both religious teachings and philosophical reasoning to understand the world.
It's like they were weaving this intricate tapestry of ideas, drawing on threads from different cultures, religions, and intellectual traditions.
Precisely, and that's what makes medieval philosophy so fascinating and full of surprises.
Okay, so we've explored the intellectual landscapes of Byzantium, the Latin West, and Islamic Spain.
Yeah.
Where does our philosophical adventure take us next?
Well, next time, we'll be stepping into the world of medieval universities, those centers of learning that transform the intellectual landscape of Europe and shaped the future of Western thought.
Sounds exciting. I can't wait to see how the philosophical game was played in those academic arenas.
Welcome back to our deep dive into medieval philosophy. Last time we saw how, philosophical exploration wasn't just happening in these quiet libraries. It was thriving in all these dynamic centers across different cultures.
Right. We explored how thinkers were engaging with ancient texts, challenging them, and forging their own paths in places like Byzantium, the Latin West, and Islamic Spain. And now we're stepping into the world of medieval universities.
Yeah, the rise of the university, it was a huge turning point in Western thought, think
Yeah.
Paris, Oxford, Bologna. These places, they weren't just schools, they were like these melting pots where knowledge was forged through debate, analysis, and some really intense questioning.
They sound like intellectual battlegrounds.
Yeah, that's a great way to put it. By the 13th century, those earlier schools had evolved into full-blown universities with faculties, structured curricula, degrees, the whole 9 yards. And they were attracting students from all over Europe.
Can you imagine the conversations that must have been happening in those, hallowed halls?
Totally. Think about it. No internet forums, no social media. The university was the place to go to hash out your ideas, to test your arguments against the brightest minds around.
Okay, so break it down for me. How are these universities structured?
Well, you had the arts faculty, which focused on subjects like logic, grammar, and natural philosophy. Aristotle's works on physics, metaphysics, and ethics. And then you had the higher faculties, theology, law, and medicine, building on what you learned in the arts faculty.
So the arts faculty was like boot camp for the mind.
Exactly. And remember how we talked about Aristotle being like the rock star of medieval philosophy? Well, once they had complete translations of his works in the 13th century, the arts faculty basically became the Aristotle faculty.
Wow, so they went all in on Aristotle. Did they just ditch everything else?
Well, not completely. These universities were still under the church. The arts faculty was supposed to stick to natural knowledge, the stuff you could figure out through reason and observation, which is where Aristotle reigns supreme, even though he wasn't a Christian.
That's a good point. So how did they deal with that potential clash between, like, philosophy and theology?
It was a delicate balance. Discussions of revealed truth, theology, that was all happening in the theology faculty. The arts faculty explored philosophical questions, but within the framework of reason and observation.
I can see how that could cause friction.
Oh, yeah, definitely. You had guys like Sigurd of Brabant and Boethius of Dacia in Paris who were really pushing the limits of what was considered acceptable within a Christian context. They were advocating for a version of Aristotelianism that didn't shy away from ideas that might contradict church teachings.
Sounds like they were playing with fire. Did they get away with it?
Well, some didn't. Sigurd and Boethius, along with a few others, got condemned by the Bishop of Paris in 1277. But their work shows how much tension there was within university philosophy, this constant struggle to make faith and reason work together.
That clash between philosophical inquiry and religious dogma is a theme that keeps coming up again and again, doesn't it?
It does. It raises all sorts of questions about, what we can really know, the authority of tradition, and the role of reason.
So you have these, like, radical philosophers pushing the boundaries, and then on the other side you have...
Then you have someone like Thomas Aquinas trying to build a bridge between faith and reason.
Yeah.
He wanted to show that Aristotle's philosophy and Christian doctrine could get along.
Aquinas. His Summa Theologiae, it's like one of the most important works in Western philosophy. What was his strategy?
Aquinas was a brilliant, systematic thinker. He believed that Aristotle's conclusions, the stuff he proved through argument, couldn't ultimately disagree with Christian teachings. He saw philosophy and theology as complementary. Each had its own domain, but they both pointed toward truth.
So he wasn't trying to force Aristotle into a theological box. He saw room for real conversation.
Yeah, exactly. Aquinas' approach was revolutionary. He didn't just dismiss Aristotle because he wasn't Christian. He really dug into Aristotle's arguments, trying to understand the logic behind them and show how they could fit into a broader theological picture.
He wasn't afraid to engage with the best of what, like, pagan philosophy had to offer.
Right. He saw reason as a gift from God, something you could use to understand both the natural world and the divine.
That's an important point. Okay, so you have these radicals pushing the limits, and you have Aquinas building bridges. Who else was shaking things up in the medieval university scene?
So as we move into the late 13th and early 14th centuries, we see a couple more giants emerge. John Duns Scotus, a Franciscan friar from Oxford, and William of Ockham, another Franciscan who ended up having a major falling out with the papacy.
Scotus and Occam, those guys were philosophical rebels, right?
They were definitely heavy hitters. Scotus, while he knew Aristotle inside and out, he felt that Aristotle's take on God was lacking. Scotus championed the idea that God's will is totally free, not bound by any kind of necessity.
So he's saying God's power trumps even logic and natural law.
Pretty much. He argued that God could have made a totally different world, with different laws if he had wanted to. This emphasis on God's freedom had a huge impact on theology and raised new questions about, how divine will and human freedom work together.
It's like he was opening up all these new philosophical possibilities.
He was. Now, Occam agreed with Scotus on God's freedom, but he took a different approach to metaphysics. He was all about simplicity. He argued that we shouldn't create unnecessary concepts or entities.
Like a philosophical minimalist.
Exactly. His famous principle, Occam's razor, is all about not multiplying entities beyond necessity. This led him to reject some of the more complex stuff in Scotus' system and develop this really streamlined approach.
Yeah, I can see how that got him into trouble with the Pope. Challenging the establishment is always risky.
It is. But both Scotus and Occam were masters of logic. They used those skills to break down philosophical problems with amazing precision.
It sounds like the medieval university was buzzing with activity. So much so that it makes me wonder, did all this philosophical energy stay within those academic walls? Or did these ideas, escape and reach a wider audience?
That's a great question. And it leads us to this really fascinating aspect of medieval philosophy that often gets overlooked, the flourishing of philosophical thought outside the university.
So philosophy was breaking free from the ivory tower.
Exactly. Some of the most famous and widely read works from the medieval period were philosophical. They tackled the big questions in ways that people from all walks of life could relate to.
Wait, so philosophy wasn't just for the scholars?
Nope. And the best example of this is probably Dante's Divina Commedia. You have this epic poem, this journey through hell, purgatory, and paradise, but it's also this profound philosophical exploration of morality, justice, and the meaning of life.
Dante. His work is just brilliant. But was he actually a philosopher?
While he may not have gone to university, but Dante was deeply engaged with the philosophical ideas of his time, especially the works of Aquinas and others. He wasn't just borrowing ideas, he was debating them, challenging them, and weaving them into his own grand vision.
Like a self-taught philosopher.
Right. His Divina Commedia wasn't just great literature, it was a philosophical tour de force, showing how poetry can grapple with the deepest human questions. It really shows how philosophical ideas could break free from the universities.
Absolutely. And Dante's work was part of a bigger trend. The whole medieval period was full of philosophical poetry, often inspired by Boethius's Consolation of Philosophy.
Oh yeah, Boethius.
Yeah.
His book was like a lifeline for so many thinkers. It was. Boethius planted a seed that really blossomed in the work of all these poets and writers. Take Jean de Meun, for example. He was a lawyer in France connected to the University of Paris. He continued writing the Roman de la Rose, this allegorical poem. He was weaving philosophical ideas into this story of courtly love and social satire.
Wait, even courtly love had a philosophical side.
Oh yeah, definitely. Medieval thinkers found philosophical stuff everywhere. And this fusion of philosophy and literature, it wasn't just in continental Europe. In England, you had writers like Chaucer and Langland who were inspired by both the Roman de la Rose and Dante's Divina Commedia. They created their own philosophical masterpieces, exploring themes of love, morality, and social justice.
It's amazing how philosophical ideas were popping up in all these different genres, crossing borders and speaking to people from all different backgrounds.
It shows that philosophy isn't just this abstract thing happening in the ivory tower, right? It's a way of engaging with the world, of wrestling with the big questions that everyone's always asking.
I love that. But I have to ask, were all these philosophical adventurers men? Did women have any say in all this?
That's a great question, and it leads us to this really exciting area of research. Rediscovering the women philosophers of the medieval period. They've been overlooked for too long.
Women philosophers back then. Tell me more.
Well, you have to remember that women weren't allowed in universities or most forms of higher education in the Latin West, so their philosophical contributions often happen outside of those traditional settings.
So they were finding other ways to engage with these big questions, to express their ideas, to make their voices heard.
Exactly. And some of these women thinkers were labeled as mystics figures, like Hildegard of Bingen, Mechthild of Magdeburg, and Julian of Norwich. Their writings are very spiritual, but they also grapple with philosophical issues in ways that can really enrich our understanding of medieval thought.
Mystics.
Yeah.
Weren't they more concerned with spiritual experiences and religious stuff than with philosophy as we understand it?
Well, their main focus might have been spiritual, but their writings show a real engagement with philosophical questions. They explored things like self-knowledge, the limits of reason, the nature of love and will, and the possibility of immortality.
So maybe we need to broaden our definition of philosophy to include these voices.
Exactly. Now, one figure who really stands out is Marguerite Porete. Her book, The Mirror of the Simple Souls, was condemned by the Inquisition.
Condemned by the Inquisition. That sounds intense.
Yeah, it was a risky time to be expressing unorthodox ideas. But Poret's book, while it uses the language of courtly romance, is actually a deeply philosophical work. She gets into some really complex arguments about love, will, and the soul's journey toward God. She challenged traditional theological views, arguing that, like, the soul in its perfect state can even transcend the need for reason and God himself.
Wow, that's a radical claim. No wonder she got in trouble. But it shows that women were engaging in philosophy at a very high level, even if they had to do it outside the mainstream.
Exactly. Another fascinating figure is Heloise. Most people know her for her tragic love affair with Peter Abelard, but she was a brilliant thinker in her own right.
Heloise. I always thought of her as just part of that love story.
Well, in her letters to Abelard, she gives these really profound insights into the nature of love. and she challenges some of his ethical views, arguing for a more moderate approach. Her voice is a powerful reminder that women were actively participating in these philosophical conversations, even if they didn't always get the credit.
It's so inspiring to see these women challenging the status quo and making their voices heard.
It shows that the human desire for knowledge and understanding, it transcends all kinds of boundaries.
Okay, so we've discovered these amazing women thinkers in the Latin Christian world. What about the Islamic and Jewish traditions? Were there any comparable figures?
Finding female philosophers in other medieval traditions can be tricky. The historical record is often incomplete, and a lot of philosophical activity was mixed in with religious and legal scholarship, which women were largely excluded from. But there are definitely some intriguing figures who engaged with philosophical themes in their work, even if they weren't called philosophers at the time.
So the search for these hidden voices continues.
It does. We have to remember that our understanding of the past is always evolving as we uncover new perspectives.
Absolutely. So who are some of these figures that might challenge our traditional ideas about who counts as a philosopher in the medieval period?
Well, in the Sufi tradition, there's Rabia al-Adoya, a mystic and poet. Her verses explored themes of divine love, renunciation, and the soul's longing for union with God. Now, whether all those poems attributed to her are actually hers is debated, but her influence on Sufi thought is clear.
So even if we can't definitively call her a philosopher, her work definitely touches on some deep philosophical questions about, the nature of reality, the meaning of life, and our relationship with the divine.
Exactly. And her voice reminds us that philosophical exploration wasn't confined to universities. It could also happen in poetry, music, and art.
Right. Philosophy isn't just about abstract arguments and jargon. It's about our search for meaning, for understanding, for something bigger than ourselves.
Absolutely. And then going back to the early days of Christian philosophy, there's Macrina, the sister of the influential theologian Gregory of Nyssa. Gregory actually credits his sister with his philosophical education, and you can see her influence in his work on the soul and the resurrection, which he says was inspired by her.
It's like she's this philosophical ghost.
Mhm.
Her influence is there, but her own voice is mostly lost to us.
Exactly. It makes you wonder how many other women philosophers are out there waiting to be rediscovered.
Shifting gears a bit, what about the Jewish communities of Christian Europe? I understand that there was this vibrant tradition of philosophical inquiry happening in Hebrew.
There was. Thinkers like Samuel Ibn Tibbon were busy translating Arabic philosophical works into Hebrew, making those ideas accessible to a much wider audience.
It wasn't just translation, though, right? Jewish philosophers were engaging with those ideas and developing their own perspectives.
Exactly. One of the key figures was Moses of Narbonne. He wrote these insightful commentaries on Maimonides' Guide of the Perplexed and Averroes' works, trying to bridge the gap between these two influential thinkers.
It's amazing to see how those philosophical threads weave together.
It's like this huge intellectual network with thinkers from all these different traditions having this conversation across centuries and continents.
Tell me about some of the other big names in Jewish philosophy.
Well, in the 14th century, you have Levi ben Gershom, known as Gersonides. He was a truly remarkable figure, a philosopher, astronomer, mathematician, and biblical commentator.
Wow, a true Renaissance man before the Renaissance.
Totally. He was deeply engaged with the works of both Maimonides and Averroes, but he was also very independent. His most important work, The Wars of the Lord, is a huge exploration of all sorts of philosophical topics.
Like what?
Oh, he tackled the nature of God, the eternity of the world, divine knowledge and human freedom, the immortality of the soul, all the big questions. His views were often pretty bold and unconventional, challenging both traditional Jewish interpretations and the Aristotelian ideas of his time.
It sounds like he was a real trailblazer.
He was, and his work had a huge impact on Jewish thought, influencing thinkers like Spinoza and sparking debates that continue to this day.
It's amazing how those philosophical lineages carry on.
Yeah, it is. And Gersonides wasn't the only one making waves in 14th century Jewish philosophy. There's also Hasdai Crescas. His work, Light of the Lord, is considered one of the deepest and most challenging philosophical treatises of the entire medieval period.
Crescas, he was the one who criticized Aristotelian science, right?
That's right. He was a sharp critic of the Aristotelian worldview, challenging some of its basic assumptions about the physical world. He argued for things like the existence of a vacuum, the possibility of multiple worlds, and the idea that time can exist without physical objects.
So he was questioning the whole scientific framework of his time.
Yeah, he was. But he wasn't just tearing things down. He also had his own original ideas about God, the soul, and the relationship between faith and reason. His work marked a turning point in Jewish philosophy, paving the way for a more independent and critical approach.
It's so cool to see how all these medieval thinkers from different cultures and religions were all wrestling with these big questions, challenging the accepted views, and contributing to this incredibly dynamic philosophical conversation.
It shows that philosophy isn't just a Western thing, right? It's a universal human endeavor.
Speaking of different traditions, what happened to the Falsafa movement in the Islamic world? Did it just disappear after Avicenna?
Not at all. It actually entered what scholars call the post-classical period. It's not as well known as the earlier period, but it's just as fascinating.
Post-classical Arabic philosophy. It sounds like a bit of a hidden chapter in the history of philosophy.
It kind of is, but it's full of interesting debates and developments.
So what were the big themes of this post-classic period? How was it different from the earlier Falsafa tradition?
Well, one key difference is that they continued to engage with Avicenna's works. He was still the big name, but his ideas were being reinterpreted and debated. Thinkers were both defending and challenging his views, which is pretty cool.
So Avicenna was still the authority, but new voices were coming up and pushing the conversation forward.
Exactly. There was also this growing tendency to blur the lines between falsafa and kalam.
So those boundaries between philosophy and theology were starting to break down.
To an extent, yeah. Thinkers were finding ways to weave philosophical ideas into their theological systems, and they were using philosophical tools to explore theological questions in new ways.
Sounds like an exciting time for ideas. Who were some of the major players in this post-classical scene?
One interesting figure is Abu Barakat al-Baghdadi. He was a Jewish scholar who converted to Islam and wrote a critique of Avicenna's philosophy. He challenged some of Avicenna's fundamental ideas, which really opened the door for a more critical approach.
So he was questioning the foundations of the whole tradition, even though he was working within it.
Exactly. His critique paved the way for Fakhr al-Din al-Razi, a famous Kalam theologian who was also really into philosophy. He wrote this super influential commentary on Avicenna's pointers and reminders.
Al-Razi. He was a master of both theology and philosophy.
He was. And his work shows this blurring of lines between a falsafa and kalam. He seems to have had different opinions on some of Avicenna's doctrines, depending on whether he was writing as a philosopher or as a theologian.
It's like he was wearing different hats, switching between these different perspectives depending on the context.
Exactly. And that flexibility is really characteristic of the post-classical period.
This is all so cool. But we've been talking a lot about general trends. Can you give me a sense of the specific philosophical problems these post-classical thinkers were wrestling with?
Sure. One major development was the emergence of the Illuminationist school, founded by Shihab al-Din al-Suhrawardi.
Illuminationist philosophy.
Yeah,
That's
kinda.
interesting.
Yeah, al-Suhrawardi was inspired by both falsafa and earlier Platonist ideas, but he came up with his own unique approach to knowledge. He argued that we can understand reality more directly through intuition and illumination than through reason and argument.
So he's putting more emphasis on experience and insight than on logic.
Right. And he was also influenced by Sufism, particularly the idea that you can directly experience the divine through spiritual practices.
So he's bringing together philosophy and mysticism.
Exactly. And his work had a big impact on later Islamic philosophy, especially in Persia and India, where illuminationist ideas continued to be important.
It's amazing how these philosophical ideas travel and evolve.
Yeah, it is. And this focus on illumination and intuition, you can also see it in the work of Sufi mystics like Muhyiddin Ibn Arabi. His writing, while not strictly philosophical, is full of philosophical language and ideas.
So Sufism, with its focus on spiritual experience, was also influencing the intellectual landscape of the time.
Absolutely. And Ibn Arabi's student, Sadra al-Din al-Qunawi, played a key role in systematizing these Sufi ideas. He created this really sophisticated framework that blended mysticism with traditional philosophy.
What a mix.
It is. And this back and forth between falsafa, kalam, and Sufism, it kept going in different ways over the centuries.
Do you have a good example of how these different threads were interacting in later debates?
Sure. One famous example is the debate between Jalal al-Din al-Dawani, a scholar who read Avicenna through the lens of al-Suhrawardi and Ibn Arabi, and the al-Dashtakis, a father and son who were more focused on Avicenna's original texts.
So even within this post-classical period, there were all these different schools of thought arguing with each other.
Exactly. And that shows how dynamic Arabic philosophy was. It kept evolving and adapting right up to the modern era.
Wow. This whole exploration of medieval philosophy has been incredible. We've traveled from Paris to Baghdad, encountered all these brilliant minds, and uncovered all these fascinating ideas. It's a reminder that these medieval thinkers were grappling with problems that are still relevant today.
That's right. They weren't just solving abstract puzzles, they were asking questions about the nature of reality, the limits of knowledge, the relationship between faith and reason, and the meaning of life questions that we're still asking today.
Exactly. And those are the questions we'll be diving into next time when we explore three key medieval problems that thinkers from all these different traditions were wrestling with: the eternity of the world, divine knowledge and human freedom, and the nature of the soul and immortality.
These problems really show how creative these medieval philosophers were, and they also highlight those deep connections between philosophy and religion, and how those questions played out differently in different cultures and religions.
I'm excited to unpack these philosophical mysteries. Okay, so we're back for the final round of our medieval philosophy deep dive. It's been a wild ride so far, from those intense debates in the Parisian schools to that whole flowering of philosophical poetry and those amazing women thinkers we talked about last time.
Yeah, it's been a whirlwind tour of medieval thought, and now we're going to tackle some of the biggest philosophical puzzles that these thinkers were wrestling with. Like we said before, these weren't just, abstract problems. They had real implications for how people understood their place in the world and what happens after we die.
Right. These were the questions that kept them up at night. So let's jump right into that first biggie, the eternity of the world. This is where we see a head-on collision between ancient Greek philosophy and the Abrahamic faiths, right?
Exactly. For Aristotle, the universe was eternal, no beginning, no end. It fit perfectly with that ancient Greek idea of cyclical time. But it created a huge problem for anyone who believed in the creation stories of Judaism, Christianity, and Islam.
Yeah, if the universe has always existed, where does God fit in?
Right. And that's a question that runs through the entire medieval period. We see thinkers struggling with this conflict, trying to find ways to reconcile the idea of an eternal universe with the belief in a creator God.
So how do they try to bridge that gap? Did they just chuck Aristotle out the window and stick to the scriptures?
Some did, but others came up with more creative solutions. John Philoponus, a Christian scholar back in the 6th century, he actually challenged Aristotle on his own turf, arguing that the idea of an infinite past contradicts Aristotle's own principles about infinity.
So he was using Aristotle's own logic against him.
Exactly. It was a brilliant move, and his arguments would be picked up and debated by later thinkers, both Christian and Islamic. Now, the Islamic philosophers, the Falasuf, guys like Al-Farabi and Avicenna, they tried to reconcile Aristotle with the Islamic creation story by saying that God is the ultimate cause, the first principle from which the universe emanates.
So God is like the prime mover, the one who starts it all off, but the universe itself has always been there.
Precisely. They imagined this kind of chain reaction, where God is the initial spark, but the universe has no beginning in time.
I can see how that could be a way to balance those two ideas. Did everyone agree with this solution?
Not at all. Al-Ghazali, remember him? That Kalam theologian who wasn't afraid to take on the philosophers. He argued that the Falasuf, by accepting an eternal world, were undermining the whole idea that God created it. He thought it was a bit of a philosophical trick, a way to pay lip service to religious doctrine while still holding on to a view that fundamentally contradicts it.
He was calling out their philosophical inconsistencies, right?
He was. He was a sharp critic, and his critique provoked a response from Averroes, that hardcore Aristotelian who saw himself as the defender of philosophy.
So how did Averroes defend the idea of an eternal universe in an Islamic context?
Well, Averroes argued that the conflict between the philosophers and the theologians was more about words than substance. He said that they both agreed on the basic categories: God as the uncaused cause, the eternal world as a whole, and the physical things that make up the world. The only real disagreement, he said, was about whether time itself goes back infinitely.
So he was downplaying the disagreement.
Exactly. He was a master of bringing together seemingly opposite views, and his efforts to bridge that gap between philosophy and theology, they had a huge influence on later Jewish and Christian thinkers.
Now, what about Maimonides? Where did he stand on the whole eternity question?
Maimonides was pretty skeptical of any attempt to combine the eternity of the world with the idea of a God who has free will. He argued that Aristotle hadn't really proven that the world is eternal, and he even suggested that Aristotle himself might have had some doubts.
So he was challenging the foundation of the Aristotelian argument.
He was. Maimonides then offered his own arguments for creation, although he admitted they weren't conclusive proofs. He emphasized that it all comes down to God's will. For Maimonides, creation was a free act, and God could have chosen to do things differently.
So he was putting the emphasis on God's freedom rather than on this idea of a necessary eternal universe.
Exactly. And this emphasis on God's will would be picked up by later Jewish philosophers who continued to wrestle with this relationship between philosophical arguments and religious beliefs.
It's amazing to see how all these thinkers from different backgrounds were all grappling with the same fundamental questions.
Absolutely. They were all drawing on both reason and revelation to try and understand the universe and our place in it.
Okay, so we've seen how this debate played out across different traditions. Is there anything else we should know about the eternity of the world?
Well, in the Latin Christian world, this debate took on its own unique dimensions. Thinkers like Boethius of Dacia, a 13th century scholar in Paris, argued that while faith tells Christians that the world had a beginning, philosophers, when they're working within the framework of natural science, have to deny it.
Wait, so he's saying philosophers have to contradict Christian teaching?
It was definitely a controversial position, but Boethius had a way of navigating that tension. He said that when philosophers deny a beginning to the world, they're talking about natural philosophy, not ultimate truth. That belongs to theology.
So he's drawing a line between those two domains of knowledge.
Exactly. It's like creating separate spheres, allowing for different kinds of truth.
Clever. Did that satisfy everyone?
Not completely, but it did influence later thinkers, including Aquinas, who also tried to bring together Aristotle and Christian teachings.
What was Aquinas' take on this?
Aquinas, in his work on the eternity of the world, he says that, yeah, creation is an article of faith, but he rejects those philosophical arguments that some people were using to try to prove it.
So he wasn't into using reason to try to prove religious beliefs.
Right. He was a big fan of reason, but he also recognized its limits. He thought some things, like the creation of the world, were beyond the reach of reason and could only be known through revelation.
He was all about balance.
He was. He wanted to show that the world could have always existed and still be caused by God, in the sense that everything depends on God.
That sounds pretty tricky.
It was. And whether he succeeded is still debated today. But his approach shows how he was trying to reconcile Aristotle with Christian theology to demonstrate how they could both be true.
It's fascinating to see how these debates about the age of the universe were tied to these deeper questions about God and the nature of reality.
Absolutely. And those connections between philosophical and theological questions are everywhere in medieval thought.
Okay, let's move on to our next big puzzle.
Mhm.
Divine prescience and human freedom. This one always messes with my head. How did these medieval thinkers even begin to deal with this apparent paradox?
It's a problem that has stumped philosophers for centuries. If God knows everything, including the future and all our choices, are we really free? Or are we just puppets on a string?
Right, it's like, if God knows I'm going to eat that extra slice of cake, can I really resist?
That's the dilemma. And medieval philosophers came up with a whole bunch of responses, some clever logical tricks, and some deep theological interpretations.
Okay, give me some examples.
Well, Peter Abelard, that logician who loved to argue, thought he had a simple solution. He said the whole problem is based on a misunderstanding of God's knowledge. Just because God knows something will happen, it doesn't mean it has to happen. His knowledge doesn't make it necessary.
So God's knowledge is more like a passive observation of the future, not something that controls our choices.
Right. Abelard's solution was popular, but it didn't convince everyone. Boethius, writing way back in the 6th century, had already identified a deeper problem. He said that for something to be truly known, it has to be fixed and unchangeable.
So if God knows the future, it means the future is already set.
Exactly, and that led Boethius to this radical conclusion. Our experience of time is limited. What seems fixed from God's eternal perspective outside of time might still be open and contingent from our point of view.
So it's all about perspective.
Exactly. Boethius' solution was both brilliant and confusing. It changed how people thought about time and the relationship between God's knowledge and human freedom.
It's a mind bender.
Yeah.
How did later thinkers deal with Boethius's ideas?
Well, Aquinas, who we know loved to synthesize, he refined and developed Boethius' ideas, going deeper into the nature of God's eternity and how it relates to divine knowledge.
I bet Aquinas had a lot to say about this.
He did. He argued that God, being outside of time, sees all moments at once, as if they're all present. This allows God to know the future without causing it. It's like watching a movie. You know the ending, but that doesn't mean you force the characters to do what they did.
That's a great analogy.
Right. Aquinas' solution preserved both God's knowledge and human freedom, but it opened up these new questions about the nature of time and how much we can really understand.
It's like solving one philosophical problem just creates new ones.
That's what keeps philosophy interesting. Now, not everyone was happy with these Boethian or Thomistic solutions. John Duns Scotus, that Franciscan who was always challenging the status quo, he came up with a completely different approach.
Scotus, what was his angle?
Scotus said the key to the whole puzzle lies in God's will. He believed that God's will isn't bound by any kind of necessity, that God is totally free to choose what he wants.
So God's freedom is the key to our freedom.
In a way, yes. Scotus said if God's will was absolutely necessary, if he couldn't have chosen differently, then our freedom would be in trouble. But because God's will is contingent, because he can choose among different possibilities, our choices can also be free.
So God's freedom is like this cosmic guarantee for our own free will. But how did Scotus deal with God's omniscience?
Well, he said that God knows all the possible worlds and all the choices we could make, but he doesn't decide which ones we will make. So God knows the potential, but not the actual outcome.
It's like God has all the pieces, but lets us put the puzzle together.
That's a great way to put it. Scotus's solution was pretty radical. It challenged the standard view of necessity in medieval philosophy and opened up new ways of thinking about possibility and freedom.
He was a real innovator. What about the Islamic philosophers? Did they have anything to say about this?
They did. Avicenna and Averroes, they believed that God only knows universals, not particulars. So they weren't as concerned with God knowing every single choice we make.
So God knows general principles, but not the specifics of our lives.
Right. But they still had to explain how God's knowledge, even if it's limited to those general principles, could somehow include the specific events of the world.
It's like trying to connect God's knowledge of the big picture to the tiny details of our lives.
Exactly. Avicenna used the analogy of a mirror that reflects the whole universe. God's knowledge is like that. It encompasses everything, both the general and the particular, without being divided or fragmented.
So God sees everything at once, the whole picture.
Yes. Now, Averroes, who always followed Aristotle pretty closely, he came up with a more complex view. He said, God's knowledge of particulars is indirect. It's mediated by the celestial spheres, those eternal heavenly bodies that govern the world below. So God knows the eternal forms of things, and those forms determine the movements of the spheres, which then influence what happens down here on Earth.
It's like a chain reaction connecting God's knowledge to the events of our world.
Exactly. It's a complicated system, very Aristotelian in its view of the universe as this hierarchy of causes and effects.
It's amazing to think about how all these different ideas were woven together.
It is. It shows how these philosophers were drawing on all sorts of different sources, philosophical, theological, even astronomical, to try to make sense of these big questions.
Now, what about Maimonides? What was his take on divine prescience?
Maimonides was a big fan of what we call negative theology. He argued that we can't really understand what it means for God to know anything. Our words, our concepts, they're just not up to the task.
Negative theology, it sounds like a very cautious way of talking about God.
It is cautious, but it's also acknowledging the limits of human reason. Maimonides said, we can get a glimpse of God's knowledge by thinking about the relationship between a craftsman and his creation. But ultimately, the nature of God's knowledge remains a mystery.
So we could say God knows everything, but we can't really grasp what that means.
Right. It's a way of affirming both God's knowledge and human freedom without pretending we understand how it all works.
Okay, I see. Did all Jewish philosophers agree with that?
Well, Gersonides, that 14th century thinker we talked about, he argued that if our language about God is really that unclear, then we can't even be sure that statements like God is a body are false. He wanted a more robust understanding of what we can say about God.
So he was pushing back against those limits. What was his solution?
Gersonides believed that God knows the general framework of the universe, but the details of our lives are indirectly determined by the stars.
Astrological determinism.
Yep. But he had an interesting twist. He said that humans, through our intellect, can actually overcome that astral determinism.
So we can outsmart fate.
In a way, yes. Gersonides thought that through reason and the pursuit of knowledge, we can choose a different path than the one laid out by the stars.
So it's about intellectual self-determination.
Exactly. It's a pretty powerful vision of human agency.
Did all Jewish philosophers buy into that astrological determinism idea?
Not at all. Crescus, another important 14th century thinker, had a different view. He thought that God knows everything, including every little detail of our lives, and that everything is causally determined ultimately by God. But he also thought this is compatible with human freedom.
Whoa, how is that possible? That sounds like a contradiction.
Kresges made a distinction between what we do because of our nature and what we do because it's causally determined. He said if our actions were determined by our nature, then all our efforts would be meaningless. But because our actions are part of this causal chain that includes our own choices and efforts, those efforts still matter.
So even though our future is set, our choices are still part of how it gets there.
Right. It's like those dominoes, each one knocking over the next. Our choices are part of that chain, even if God set it in motion.
So it's a kind of compatibilist view of freedom and determinism.
Exactly. Kresges offered a unique perspective on this problem, acknowledging the complexity of how God's knowledge, human freedom, and the structure of the universe all fit together.
These medieval thinkers were really tackling these big questions in incredibly sophisticated ways.
Absolutely. And it leads us to our final problem, the soul and immortality. What is the soul, and what happens after we die? These questions were just as important for medieval philosophers as they were for the ancient Greeks.
Okay, let's explore this one. What were the main ideas about the soul and the afterlife?
Well, they were heavily influenced by the different views of Plato and Aristotle. Remember, Plato thought the soul is a separate immaterial thing trapped in the body and wanting to escape.
Right, like a bird in a cage.
Exactly. Aristotle had a more down-to-earth view. He said the soul is the form of the body, the thing that makes it alive and organized.
More integrated then.
Exactly. And because the soul is so connected to the body, Aristotle didn't believe in personal immortality like Plato did.
So no heaven or hell for Aristotle's soul.
Not for the individual soul. He thought some aspect of the intellect might be eternal, but it wouldn't be our individual selves.
Okay, so you've got Plato's dualism and Aristotle's hylomorphism. How did the medieval thinkers fit these ideas into their religious beliefs?
It was complicated. One key belief of the Abrahamic faiths, for example, is the resurrection of the body.
Right, we'll be raised from the dead in our physical body.
Exactly. And that created some problems for the Platonic view of the soul. If the soul is already immortal, what's the point of bringing the body back?
Like double immortality.
Right. Now, the Islamic philosophers, like Avicenna, they drew on Aristotle, but they came up with their own ideas. Avicenna said that each person has an intellect that's immaterial and immortal, but it's separate from the rest of the soul, which is more connected to the body.
A kind of mix of Plato and Aristotle.
Exactly. Avicenna's ideas were super influential, both in the Islamic world and in the Latin West.
What about Averroes? How did he handle this problem?
Well, Averroes, always the loyal Aristotelian, he disagreed with Avicenna's interpretation. He said there is an immortal intellect, but it's not individual to each person. It's a universal intellect that exists independently of us.
Like a giant universal mind.
Yes, Averroes thought this universal intellect needs humans, with our senses and imaginations, to give it material to think about. He said it's like the relationship between a light and the things it illuminates.
So our brains are like reflectors for this universal mind. But doesn't that mean that we don't exist as individuals after death?
That was the implication, and it caused quite a stir, especially among Christian thinkers. They saw it as contradicting the idea of individual salvation.
Yeah, that would definitely be a problem.
It was. Now, Maimonides, the Jewish philosopher, he had a different focus. He emphasized the importance of intellectual pleasures, saying those are the highest form of happiness. He didn't think those bodily rewards that people talk about in connection with resurrection were all that important.
So he thought the mind was more important than the body, even in the afterlife.
Exactly. But he still said bodily resurrection is a key part of Jewish belief, even though how that fits with his other ideas is still debated today.
It's that tension between faith and reason again.
Yep. And then there's Aquinas, who always tried to reconcile Aristotle with Christianity. He rejected both Averroes' idea of a single separate intellect and Avicenna's dualism.
So he tried to carve out his own path.
Exactly. He said that each person has their own individual immaterial soul, which is the form of the body. But because the intellect, unlike our senses, doesn't depend on a physical organ, he thought the soul could survive and function on its own after death.
So he kept the idea of individual immortality, but grounded it in Aristotle.
Exactly. He wanted to show how a philosophical system based on the natural world could still support belief in an afterlife.
These are such huge questions, and it's inspiring to see how these thinkers tried to find answers.
It shows how much they cared about the meaning of life and the possibility of something beyond this world.
Okay, before we wrap things up, I have one more question. We talked about how logic was a big part of the medieval curriculum, both in the Islamic world and in Europe. But why? Why was it given such importance?
That's a great question. It's one of the key differences between ancient and medieval philosophy. The ancient Greeks were brilliant at logic, but it was never a central part of their education system.
So it was more like a specialized field.
Exactly. But in the medieval world, logic was the foundation. It was considered essential for training the mind, for developing reasoning skills, and for preparing students for debate.
Like mental training.
Right. And people thought it was useful for other things too. In the Islamic world, Al-Ghazali, even though he criticized the philosophers, he was a big advocate for studying logic. He thought it was essential for understanding the Quran, making legal arguments, and debating theology.
So it had real-world applications.
It did, and you see that practical focus in how Arabic logic developed. They built on Aristotle's work, but they also expanded it in new directions, developing sophisticated systems of modal logic and propositional logic.
So they took Aristotle's ideas and ran with them.
Exactly.
Uh,
And this rich tradition of Arabic logic had a huge influence, eventually making its way back to Europe.
Amazing. What about the Latin West? What happened to logic in those universities that were so into Aristotle?
Once they had complete translations of Aristotle's logical works in the 13th century, those texts quickly became central to the curriculum. The Organon, that's the name for all of Aristotle's works on logic, it was the textbook for medieval Europe.
Aristotle was back in a big way.
He was. But they didn't just accept his ideas blindly. They really dug into the texts, debated different interpretations, and even developed their own branches of logic.
It sounds like a lively intellectual scene.
It was. Along with studying Aristotle, Latin thinkers created this new branch of logic called Logica Modernorum. It was a kind of updated version of Aristotle's
A
system.
medieval remix.
You could say that. This new logic included all sorts of things. Theories about how words refer, explorations of propositional logic, even this argument game called obligations.
They were getting pretty creative.
They were. And these developments in Logica Modernorum would go on to shape philosophical and theological debates for centuries.
Logic really had a huge impact on how people thought in the medieval world.
It did. And it's still relevant today. Some of those tools and concepts developed by medieval thinkers are now being used in computer science, artificial intelligence, and even psychology.
It's like this ancient tradition is still alive and well.
Exactly. It's a great example of how ideas can travel across time and inspire new discoveries.
Well, this has been an incredible journey through the world of medieval philosophy. We've met so many brilliant minds and wrestled with some really profound questions. It's amazing to see how relevant these ideas still are today.
It's been a pleasure exploring these ideas with you. I'm always amazed by how rich and diverse medieval philosophy was. It's a reminder that the search for truth and meaning is something that connects us across the centuries.
Right. We've only scratched the surface, but I hope this deep dive has made you curious to learn more about these fascinating thinkers and to discover the power of medieval philosophy to make us think in new ways.
Keep those philosophical wheels turning.